thank you very much all for being here tonight, this morning, this afternoon, wherever you are. And we're very pleased to be celebrating the launch of our book with you all. It's customary in Australia to acknowledge country, and I'd like to do that because this is a relatively public meeting and there are some Australians here. So I'm connecting with you from the lands of the Wurundjeri people. The map indicates where Melbourne is or Naarm is. And I wish to acknowledge them as the traditional owners of this land. I also pay my respects to their elders, past and present, and the elders of other communities who might be here today, and other First Nations people who are with us today. So we've got a little bit of a program planned. We'll make a few sort of customary editorial comments. We won't, spend too much time doing that. Now, our Western Hemisphere colleagues, time is a bit of a problem for getting everyone in the Zoom. So Martha has very kindly created a video, which I'm going to screen to make a few comments. So Martha was one of our contributors. So it's nice to have a message from San Francisco tonight. And we've invited Felicitas from Zurich. So Felicitas is not a contributor, but has a lot of very interesting things to say about narrative and ethics and biomedicine and pandemics. So I'm really keen to hear what Felicitas has to say. And then we thought, we're not going to read parts of the book. It's all wonderful, but maybe we could have a more general discussion. And I guess what we'd like to focus on is not so much what happens with the book or with COVID, but what we're thinking about now in our critical inquiry and our engagement practices. So that's what we've got in mind, but let's see where the conversation takes us, if that's okay. So first up, Silvia, did you want to start us off, please?
Thank you, and great to see everybody. Thank you for joining us today to celebrate our book launch online. My name is Silvia Camporesi. I am a professor of bioethics and sport ethics at KU Leuven, and I'm really honored to be here today. I think, first of all, I'd like to thank my wonderful co-editors, Mark Davis and Sanny Mulubale, for what was a terrific journey that lasted, I think, almost 4 years. But Mark, I think it's fair to say, Mark had the idea and brought us along this wonderful journey. As you can read in the book, Mark will tell you this started off some seminar series during the pandemic, but I think all of us, if we think back at those time during the pandemic, personally, I was in lockdown in Italy, and I've written about it. Also, part of the introductory chapter, I made some remarks about the narrative approach and looking at critically at some of the narratives that were used to frame the emergency. But for me personally, it's been very meaningful to be able to write and think with great colleagues and friends about the pandemic. So I'm really grateful for that. In terms of the title of the book, Crisis, Inequity, and Legacy, this is like the main thematic framework, thematic frame of the book around these 3 pillars. I just want to say a couple of words about the third pillar, the pillar of legacy. From my point of view, I think that was particularly meaningful in a narrative approach to the pandemic, also looking at the scholarship on health and illness, is that the narrative approach can help us remedy forgetfulness. What does it mean to remedy forgetfulness? Well, it can mean different things, but something that was obvious to all of us as editors and to the contributors of of the book was that during the time of crisis and emergency, it seemed that all the political leaders and the people in charge that were actually making decisions for all of us were not aware of the pre-COVID past. And some of the contributions in our edited volume, especially in the third section of the volume titled Epistemic Justice and Reconciliation, actually show that we have a pre-COVID pandemic past, and it's really important to look back at how previous pandemics were dealt with, so as a historical, with a historical approach that is a bit broader to try to learn from the past. Our humans, we know we are always quite forgetful in many ways. But also a narrative approach can help us reach, if not closure, because we are actually challenging in the final chapter whether closure is ever possible for the pandemic, and we will, I'm sure, discuss it today, but whether a narrative approach can help us reach reconciliation. So reconciliation and closure through a narrative approach, and this is something that I'm sure my co-editors and contributors will talk more about. We also wanted to make sure that we talked about long COVID, which there are contributions that touch upon this in our volume, and also contribution that talk about other illnesses. So intersectionality intersects in many different ways, but definitely I think it's evident how COVID intersected also with many other illnesses, and the pandemic we could see some hierarchies being put in place. So our book is open-ended in a way, because as I said, it's we actually challenge whether closure has been achieved for the pandemic, and but a narrative approach can really, with this book, we hope that people will be able to challenge some of the dominant narratives that were used to frame the pandemic as a health crisis only, and think about all the other elements, all the other aspects of the pandemic beyond the health emergency only. And actually we were very, I mean, again, and I'm closing here, thanks to Mark, because you know, after the pandemic, I think many editors and publishers were like, oh, we're not really interested in publishing a book about the pandemic. People don't want to hear about it. They are sick and tired and just want to forget about it. And on the other hand, with Mark's leadership, we were able to have a contract for UP, and I think it's really important that we actually go back to those times and think together collectively about the legacy and the cultural legacy of the pandemic. So here I'm closing with my remarks and leaving the online Zoom floor to Sanny, I think.
Thanks, Silvia. Sanny.
Thank you very much, Silvia, and welcome everyone. We're grateful that you could spare some time to be a part of this book launch. And just to build up on the remarks by Silvia, I think the preparation of this book using narrative approaches or approach was very important for us, because in some way it signified a sense of what I would call justification for public policies. And as you see from the chapters, there's a whole lot of data or information around why narratives can be an important part of influencing not just practice, but how prepared nations are to pandemics such as COVID-19. So in the book, you notice also that the narrative approach that was applied was useful, because it really helped us or can help readers understand how narrative public health has to be not only construed but understood and also appropriated. So within the justification of why we applied a narrative approach in understanding the pandemic, it's also linked to the importance of how we should look at any action that threatens life using a collective lens. And so most of our chapters are really foregrounded in views or stories from participants themselves. So this is evidence-based type of data that you find in the book, but also the foregrounding of the content is really not in its secondary way of being written, but it comes from the participants themselves. And that's why within the collection of the text, we hope that readers will be able to look at or appreciate the meanings that these stories have from the narrators themselves, and how these stories can create a sense of identity, but also group belonging and collective action to a larger degree. And this part really ties up to the work that I've been doing over the last 8 to 10 years now around identity, especially on ethnicity. So in times of crisis or threat to life, it's very important that stories are used as a basis of looking at social identity and also a sense or creating a sense of belonging. So within the text, you probably also see the linkages or the synergy between life worlds and also power relations. So more importantly is to look at how are these inequalities contextualized, because the book has a very diverse and broad content that comes from different country contexts. So again, it's very important that we look at the text with the lens of bringing out a sense of life worlds, but also power relations. So we hope that the book will support not just critical social science, but also push forward the frontiers of knowledge in terms of scholarship on pandemics and how nations are prepared. So it's a privilege to be a part of this process of making sure that we produce something that scholars and practitioners will use. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sanny. So it's pretty hard to add much to what's already been said. And Silvia's also made mention that we did seminars during COVID, sharing our work, keeping networked, reflecting on what was happening then and now in the pandemic. And as we went through that process over about a year, it seemed to us that a kind of book was taking shape. So that's what we've, tried to do, I guess, is to use a narrative method to sustain ourselves, to sustain our critical research, and also offer something to scholarship. I'm very much interested in critical social science and humanities on pandemics. It seemed to us that, I don't know whether you've noticed, but there quite a few people have published on COVID and being a bit sort of cheeky about it, putting COVID into any title you could imagine of people's research, as if somehow that was a justified way of reflecting on one's current research practice. So I guess we wanted to bring something more critical and searching and problematizing and complex into how we talk about the pandemic, looking at social science and making friends with people in the humanities and vice versa. We've always been interested in a kind of a narrative public health, sort of a narrative as a way of thinking about public health ethics, about equity, about social justice, about difference and power. So I think the book is, it's not, I'm going to be grand enough to say it's a milestone, but it's certainly an experiment in this kind of notional narrative public health, in the way we have narrative medicine and illness narratives and patient testimonials. How can we bring the critical toolbox of narrative inquiry into thinking about what happens in public health. Something so densely complicated as a global pandemic, warrants this kind of inquiry. So in terms of where I am now, having, as Silvia said, this has been a long kind of row to hoe, and we do want to thank the patience of all of our contributors staying with us all this time. We're very, very grateful because we think the book looks fantastic, and we hope you do too. So now I'm thinking more about inclusion and social justice in my work. And I increasingly thinking about how these principles can be not just something we do after we've developed public health policy and communications, but something that's the starting point of our policy making. So something like pandemic preparedness, not accreting after the medicos and the politicians and the economists have decided what is best, starting to think about diversity and equity. Really, that conversation needs to drive preparedness. In a sense, we're questioning whether preparedness fully captures the fact that pandemics are with us all the time. Somewhere on the globe, people are living with pandemics, sometimes multiple pandemics. So preparedness seems like a kind of privileged kind of state to think that you're between pandemics, anticipating the next one and getting ready, when quite a lot of us are dealing with pandemics all the time. So, how we think about privilege, the syndemic quality of pandemics and the kind of pandemic existence is something that I'm really thinking about. The experience of actually doing the book too and editing, and the richness of the materials that people provided across their different disciplines and global locations really started to make me think about participatory methods and the meaning of public engagement and how we think about power when we do public engagement in particular ways. So that's where the book and this experience has taken my practice. And I really do want to thank all of our contributors and my wonderful editors for having helped me to think in these ways about our work. So what I want to do now, before we have Felicitas present, is just show you the talk from Martha Lincoln. So people who arrived late, Martha was one of our contributors. She's in San Francisco. She's fast asleep now. So we decided a video might be a way of her participating, and she's done a lovely talk for us. So I'm just going to present that now.
Hi, I'm Martha Lincoln. I'm a medical and cultural anthropologist at San Francisco State University. Thank you so much for letting me share these comments in video form. I'll try to be pretty brief. Let me say it's a lovely honor.
Can we see the video? We can't see the video. We can hear, but we can't see the video.
Oh, let's hang on. That's because I didn't share. Hang on. Thank you, Sanny. Let's try this. Can you see it now?
I'm Martha Lincoln. I'm a medical and cultural anthropologist at San Francisco State University. Thank you so much for letting me share these comments in video form. I'll try to be pretty brief. Let me say it's a lovely honor to be celebrating the publication of this wonderful edited volume. Thank you so much, Mark, Sanny, and Silvia, for all of your time and care in conceptualizing and assembling this book. And congratulations to all of the contributors. It's so great to have all of your chapters out in the world. I'm the author of Chapter 6 in this volume, which discusses how the rhetoric of US leaders cast the population of this country as both resilient and disposable in the context of the coronavirus pandemic. And to speak a bit about my current research, I have a couple of projects, each of which draws on my COVID work in a way. First, I'm developing research on the impact of generative artificial intelligence, particularly in higher education. And secondly, I'm studying online health and wellness influencing, which is an understudied phenomenon that is quite important in the United States presently. Generative AI is a topic that's close to home because my university recently signed a contract that provides ChatGPT to all of our students. And I oppose this initiative. I'm currently organizing against it with some colleagues and collaborators. And that's partly because I see this as a waste of resources. I think that ChatGPT undermines our students' learning. But further, I see some of the darker strains of American pandemic narratives in the project of generative AI. During the active pandemic in this country, narratives of human replaceability, interchangeability, fungibility, and disposability excused and encouraged preventable loss of life among socially devalued cohorts. And this was a concern that preoccupied me. I'm seeing some of this same dehumanizing ethos inherent in Gen AI, which is a technology based on the idea that human capacities can be alienated and repurposed, not just to automate reasoning, but also to make people redundant. So I see Gen AI as a biopolitical project, much as the US pandemic was managed and conceived of in biopolitical terms. So I've written about AI's impacts for inside higher education, and in the San Francisco Chronicle. These are opinion pieces, and I have a forthcoming piece in Academe with a co-author who also released this preprint with me titled "Let Them Eat Large Language Models: Artificial Intelligence and Austerity in the Neoliberal University." And we hope this will be coming out in a peer-reviewed format sometime soon. Here's a petition that we're also currently circulating to oppose ChatGPT in the California State University system, just in case anyone might be interested in signing or sharing them. Thank you. My second project addresses online health influencing, or the practice of using social media and short-form video to communicate messages about health and wellness to a digital public. This is often seen as a niche phenomenon, but I argue that it is actually a key piece of the cultural surround that brought the United States from the experience of the coronavirus pandemic to a second Trump term. Influencer figures are very powerful in the Trump administration, as you all may be aware, including individuals such as Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who's now the Secretary of our Health and Human Services Department. But much less well-known and less institutionally powerful figures also have a seat at the table in current conversations about federal health policy, and that is largely owing to the role of online health influencing. So in my research, I'm ethnographically examining the production and consumption of online health influencing narratives, exploring how influencers and their audiences think about the COVID-19 pandemic, and studying the effects of an increasingly powerful online culture of health influence. If you might like to hear more about this, please consider tuning into a meetup. This is also online at the Brochet Foundation in Switzerland later this spring. This will feature myself, Rachel Kent of King's College London, and Marco Zanone of University of Ottawa. We'll be discussing digitally disseminated misinformation and the social, political, and economic dynamics that drive it. So it would be wonderful to see any and all of you in that audience and to connect with you otherwise as well. Please feel free to be in touch. But I promised I'd try to be brief, so let me stop here. Thanks so much for your time, everyone, and congratulations again on the debut of this great book.
Lovely talk, as I said, and I'm hoping that we can pick up on some of those comments and reflections about where we are now with our work. So, as promised, let's now move to our panelist. So Felicitas, helping us think even more critically about our work. Hang on a bit.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing the slides. And first of all, a big thanks to Silvia, Mark, and Sanny, who invited me here as a panelist. Just to introduce myself quickly, I'm a senior researcher right now at the Institute of Biomedical Ethics and History of Medicine at the University of Zurich in Switzerland. My background is actually in political philosophy and bioethics. So I did a lot on theories of justice and recently also on discrimination. Now I'm kind of interested also in questions related to philosophy of technology and neuroethics. Yeah, I'm very honored to exactly present my comment. It's a written comment. I hope that's okay in maybe a very French and narrative manner. Okay, I will start. So I read the book with great interest, and I believe it represents a very important contribution to what we might call the post-COVID reappraisal and the pandemic and its narratives. While reading it, I repeatedly had the sense that this is precisely what we need at this moment. Not another abstract principled argument for some moral rightness or wrongness, not an evaluation of policies, but a narrative account that takes lived experiences seriously. So just to situate a little bit the narrative account in applied ethics quickly before moving to the book. In its minimal form, narrative ethics complements rather than replaces traditional moral principles. In bioethics, for example, narrative approaches emphasize the importance of first-person stories from patients, caregivers, and clinicians, adding depth and context to principle-based analysis. However, in a morally more far-reaching formulation, narrative ethics becomes part of moral interpretation and moral judgment itself. On this view, ethical analysis should remain open to multiple or a plurality of perspectives, allowing those who suffer to tell their own stories without being reduced to clinical cases or policy variables. Narrative ethics thus becomes a method of uncovering inequities and justice, and including epistemic injustice. So the next slide. Yeah. Now, that brings me to the book and the hermeneutic dimension of the book, and in particular to its engagement with narration that is similar, to me, it sounds similar to what Paul Ricoeur would understand under narrative approaches. Ricoeur's approach is not directly action guiding in the sense of producing moral rules. Rather, narrative functions as interpretation. Stories first and foremost reveal conflicts, moral tensions, and possibilities for action, but they do not automatically generate prescriptions. They help us to see what is at stake in human flourishing, while judging and practical reasoning remains indispensable. The three editors endorse a recurring stance in a way, as they note several thinkers in narrative ethics caution that narratives do not directly tell us what is morally right or wrong. Instead, it helps us interpret and understand conditions and situations. A particularly important contribution of the volume lies in the development of so-called counter-narratives. During the COVID-19 pandemic, narratives were widely used to influence public perception and behavior. This volume, however, adopts a critical posture, using narrative to explore lived experience and the broader human impact of the pandemic. It emphasizes hidden and marginalized perspectives, and it engages with what could be described as a herméneutique de la différence. It also resists simplistic hero narratives, pathos-laden narratives, and reduces framing of sacrifice and blame. Closely related is the book's effort to remedy forgetfulness, as Silvia mentioned, and reassess dominant public narratives. COVID-19 also revealed how quickly lessons from past pandemics, HIV, SARS, H1N1, Ebola, were forgotten. In line with Ricoeur's concern for collective memory, the book shows how pandemic narratives shape collective memory and influence responses to future global health crises. However, I think there is another dimension of the book that goes beyond this hermeneutic dimension of understanding the pandemic. So I think the ambition of the book could be is actually too modest. I think the authors and the contributors, sorry, and the editors do actually go beyond this recurring stance. For me, in some sense, I suggest that there's a deeper moral implication when it comes to the cultivation of virtues and moral imagination. One such implication concerns what I said is moral cultivation of virtues and moral imaginations. Thinkers such as Martha Nussbaum have argued that narrative fosters empathy and ethical nuance. Understanding and empathy were often strikingly absent during the pandemic. In this sense, the book can be read as an attempt to recover what might be called the other voice, opening up ethical discourse rather than closing it through premature claims about moral rightness or wrongness. Also, the other dimension is relational and contextual ethics. What came into focus during the COVID-19 pandemic is that ethical judgment is always socially embedded. Following the approach of the sociologist Marcel Mauss, the pandemic can be understood as a total social fact. This is also mentioned in one of the chapters. So it affects the economic, legal, moral, and social domains simultaneously of our lives. Faced with such complexity, reliance on abstract principle-based ethics alone risks flattening lived realities. In this context, narratives may be uniquely capable of addressing the ethical dimension of a phenomenon that can be considered a total social fact. Ethics here appears as a relational and contextual category. It seems wrong to only pick up certain aspects for moral analysis. We could say doing normative justice to a total social fact may consist in a plurality of values, voices, and perspectives. The same applies to relational contexts more broadly. Moral rightness cannot be defined in isolation from relationships, social status, and asymmetries of power. The book underscores this point by assembling narratives from diverse global contexts, and it's true the contributors are from different countries, and they differently had to address the COVID-19 pandemic and the global complexities. These contributions in the book and narratives highlight the intersecting forms of injustice and including epistemic injustice, disruptions in schooling, caregiving, access to healthcare, chronic illness, etc., etc. So coming to the last slide, the outlook. Finally, the book points us towards both remembrance and reconciliation. Learning from the past requires acknowledging how pandemic narratives have been forgotten and distorted, but it also requires asking how we might reconcile the future. How do we deal ethically and socially from what we experienced? The editors and contributors offer an answer through narrative accounts that open up discourse rather than foreclose it through rigid moral binaries. As they write, the editors write, the book resists simple pandemic endings in two ways. First, by critiquing endings that apply only to some while the pandemic continues for others through social and economic reverberations. And second, by refusing to overlook the deep health inequities that have been exacerbated and entrenched by COVID-19. So in this sense, the volume does not offer it does not close, but open up a discourse. And I would now like to open up the discussion, to all the contributors and invited, people who are here today. And as discussed before with Mike, Silvia, and Sanny, maybe taking the book as a basis to talk about the engagement into practice in the future. What have we learned for the future and preparedness?